I still remember the exact moment my husband ended our 27-year marriage like it meant nothing. We were sitting in our kitchen in San Diego, the same place where we had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet Sunday mornings for nearly 3 decades. Robert didn't even look nervous. He simply folded his hands on the table and said almost casually, "Mary, I'm leaving you." Then he added something that hurt even more. "There's someone else. She's younger. She actually wants something out of life." At that moment, I thought the worst thing that could happen to a woman was being abandoned after giving someone the best years of her life. I had no idea the real shock was still coming, because the man who walked out on me believed he was leaving a powerless, ordinary woman. He had absolutely no idea that I was about to become a $2 billion headline. Before I continue, I'd really love to know who's here with me tonight. If this story already has you curious, take a second to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of what happened. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always read your stories and your perspectives, and sometimes they remind me that none of us go through heartbreak alone. Robert didn't raise his voice when he told me he was leaving. That might have been the most painful part. He said it the same way someone might mention they were changing jobs or canceling a dinner reservation. "Mary, I'm leaving you." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. We had been married for 27 years. 27 years of shared bills, shared holidays, shared memories. You don't just walk away from something like that with one quiet sentence. At least, that's what I used to believe. I stared at him across the kitchen table, trying to find some hint of emotion on his face. Regret, sadness, even guilt. But there was none. Robert Johnson had already made up his mind long before that conversation ever happened. Outside the window, the late evening sun was fading over our San Diego neighborhood. The golden light filled the kitchen in that warm, familiar way it always did. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like the end of something I didn't even realize was dying. "I don't understand," I said quietly. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, like it belonged to someone else. Robert leaned back in his chair and sighed as if this conversation was exhausting him. "Mary, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Harder than it needs to be." I felt something tighten in my chest. "What are you talking about?" I asked. He rubbed his temple like a man dealing with a minor inconvenience. "This marriage hasn't worked for a long time." The words landed heavily between us. I searched my memory desperately, trying to find the moment when everything supposedly stopped working. Was it last Christmas when we hosted dinner for his law firm partners? Was it our anniversary trip to Napa 2 years ago? Or the countless quiet evenings when we sat on the couch watching old movies together? Nothing about those memories felt like a broken marriage, but apparently, Robert had been living a completely different life inside the same house. Then he said the sentence that shattered whatever illusions I had left. "There's someone else." I felt the air leave my lungs. The room suddenly seemed smaller. "Someone else," I repeated. Robert nodded. "Yes." He paused for a moment before adding something that felt like a deliberate knife twist. "She's younger." Of course she was. "She actually has ambition, Mary," he continued. "She wants something bigger out of life." I blinked slowly, trying to process what he had just said. "So that's what this is about?" I asked. Robert shrugged. "It's about reality." Reality. I almost laughed at that word. For 27 years, I had supported Robert through law school, through the early years of his career when money was tight, through the endless late nights and stressful cases. When he first started his corporate law practice, there were months when we weren't sure how we would cover the mortgage. Back then, ambition didn't seem to be a problem. Back then, I was exactly the kind of wife he needed. But time has a strange way of rewriting history. "And what exactly does she do?" I asked quietly. Robert hesitated for a second. "She's an influencer." The word sounded ridiculous in the silence of our kitchen. "An influencer," I repeated. "She runs a lifestyle channel," he said quickly, as if trying to make it sound more impressive. "Travel, fashion, that kind of thing." I looked down at my hands resting on the table. My fingers were trembling slightly. "How old is she?" I asked. Robert didn't answer right away. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Finally, he said it. "She's 24. 24. I was 54 years old. For a moment, the math felt surreal. The woman who had replaced me was 30 years younger than I was. 30. She's closer in age to our daughter than to you, I said quietly. Robert shifted uncomfortably. That's not the point, but it was exactly the point. A long silence filled the kitchen. I realized then that Robert had probably rehearsed this conversation in his head many times. Every word had likely been planned in advance, except he hadn't planned for my reaction, because the truth was, I didn't know how to react. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just felt empty. What happens now? I asked after a while. Robert reached into the leather briefcase sitting beside his chair. That was when I understood something terrifying. This conversation hadn't been spontaneous. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table toward me. "Those are the divorce papers," he said. The words felt unreal. "You already filed? I've spoken with my lawyer." Of course he had. Robert had always been good at planning things carefully. I slowly opened the folder. The legal language blurred slightly as my eyes scanned the pages. Property division, asset disclosure, settlement terms. The more I read, the clearer one thing became. Robert had arranged everything to his advantage. The house was in his name. Most of our investments were connected to his law firm accounts. Even some of the retirement funds had complicated legal structures I didn't fully understand. By the time I finished reading, a cold realization settled in my stomach. Robert wasn't just leaving me. He was leaving me with almost nothing. "You've thought about this for a long time," I said quietly. Robert didn't deny it. I didn't want things to get messy. Messy. 27 years of marriage reduced to a neat legal strategy. "I'm offering you a fair settlement," he added. Fair. The word felt almost insulting. "You'll be fine, Mary," he continued. "You always live simply anyway." That sentence hurt more than I expected, because he was right about one thing. I had always lived simply. I worked part-time teaching art classes at a community center. I never cared much about luxury or status. While Robert climbed the ladder in corporate law, I focused on things that made me happy: painting, teaching, volunteering. For most of our marriage, I believed that balance made us stronger. Now I wondered if Robert had seen it as weakness all along. "When did this start?" I asked. Robert exhaled slowly. "About a year ago, a year. That meant while we were celebrating holidays together, while we were attending family events, while we were sitting in this very kitchen sharing dinners. Robert had already been building another life with someone else. She understands me," he said. The sentence sounded almost rehearsed. I closed the folder slowly. For the first time that evening, I looked directly into his eyes. "You've already made your decision," I said. Robert nodded. "Yes." The calm certainty in his voice made something inside me finally settle. The truth was, nothing I said would change his mind. Robert had already walked away from our marriage long before this conversation happened. This meeting was just a formality, a legal step, a way to cleanly erase 27 years. "Take your time reading the documents," he said, standing up from the table. "My lawyer expects your response within a week." He picked up his briefcase. For a brief moment, I wondered if he might hesitate, if he might look back at the life we had built together. But he didn't. Robert walked toward the front door with the quiet confidence of a man who believed his future was already secured. Just before he left, he paused. "One more thing," he said. I looked up. "You'll probably see Chloe on social media soon. I'd appreciate it if you handled this like an adult." Chloe. So that was her name. 24 years old, ambitious, exciting. Everything Robert apparently believed I was no longer. The front door closed behind him a moment later. The house fell into complete silence. For a long time, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers. I thought the worst thing that could happen to a woman was being abandoned after nearly 3 decades of marriage. I thought the pain of betrayal was the hardest thing a person could face. At that moment, I truly believed my life had just fallen apart. What I didn't know, what Robert definitely didn't know, was that the man who had just walked out of my life believed he was leaving an ordinary woman with no power. And in a strange, unbelievable way, he was about to make the biggest mistake of his entire life. The first night after Robert left the house, I barely slept. For 27 years, the quiet rhythm of another person breathing beside me had been part of my life. Even during the times when Robert worked late or traveled for cases, I always knew he would eventually return home. That night, the house felt different. Not peaceful. Empty. Every small sound seemed louder than usual. The ticking of the kitchen clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, even the distant traffic from the street outside. At some point around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and walked into the living room. The moonlight filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Our home suddenly felt less like a place where memories were made, and more like a museum of things that no longer mattered. Family photos still hung on the walls. There was one from our 20th anniversary trip to Italy. Robert had his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling in front of the Colosseum. Looking at that photo now felt almost surreal. The man in that picture seemed like a completely different person from the one who had calmly handed me divorce papers a few hours earlier. By morning, exhaustion finally caught up with me. But life unfortunately doesn't pause just because your heart is breaking. My phone buzzed around 9. It was my friend Laura Mitchell. Laura and I had known each other since college. She was one of the few people who always told the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. "Mary," she said. As soon as I answered, "Please tell me you're sitting down," that sentence alone made my stomach tighten. "I'm sitting," I said cautiously. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Have you checked Instagram this morning?" "No," I said. "I think you should." I didn't even have an Instagram account. Social media had never interested me much. But Laura sent me a link anyway. When I opened it, the first thing I saw was a photo. Robert was standing on a rooftop terrace somewhere downtown holding a glass of champagne. Beside him stood a young woman with long blonde hair and a wide, confident smile. She looked exactly like the type of person who belonged on social media. Flawless skin, perfect makeup, designer dress, and Robert looked happy. The caption underneath the photo read, "New beginnings with my favorite person." The account name was Chloe Carter. So this was her, the woman Robert had chosen over 27 years of marriage. I scrolled through more of her photos. There were dozens. Pictures from luxury restaurants, beach vacations, designer shopping trips, and sprinkled among those photos were newer ones that included Robert. In one photo, he was standing beside her in front of a sleek modern building. The caption read, "Celebrating my new home in downtown San Diego." I stared at the image carefully. The building looked familiar. Then it hit me. That was one of the most expensive luxury towers in the city. Penthouse apartments there could easily cost several $1,000,000. Laura spoke again on the phone. "I did a little research," she said cautiously. "Research?" I asked. "Mary, Robert bought that penthouse 2 months ago. 2 months. That meant while we were still living together, eating dinner at the same table, watching television in the same living room, Robert had already purchased a new home for another woman." "I'm sorry," Laura said softly. I didn't respond for a moment. Strangely, the pain I expected to feel wasn't there in the way I imagined. Instead, there was a cold, quiet realization spreading through my mind. Robert hadn't just fallen in love with someone else. He had planned an entirely new life, and he had been building it for months while pretending nothing was wrong. "Mary," Laura said gently. "I'm here," I replied. "You don't have to go through this alone." I appreciated her words more than she probably realized, but the reality was, some kinds of pain can't really be shared. A few hours later, there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, a courier stood outside holding a large envelope. "Mary Johnson," he asked. "Yes." He handed me the envelope and asked for a signature. The moment I saw the law firm's name printed in the corner, I knew exactly what it was: Robert's lawyers. Inside were several documents, formal divorce filings, financial disclosures, and something labeled settlement proposal. I sat down at the kitchen table and began reading. The legal language was dense, full of complicated terms and paragraphs, but the meaning became clear very quickly. Robert had structured everything carefully. The house we lived in was technically in his name because he had purchased it through a legal investment entity connected to his firm. Most of our joint savings accounts were small compared to the larger financial assets controlled through his professional partnerships. Even the retirement funds had complicated legal arrangements that made them difficult to divide. By the time I finished reading, the message was obvious. Robert wasn't just leaving me. He had positioned himself to walk away with almost everything. The settlement proposal offered me a small monthly payment for a limited number of years. And that was it. No share of the house, no claim to his professional earnings, nothing close to what you might expect after nearly 3 decades of marriage. I leaned back in my chair slowly. It was impressive in a disturbing kind of way. Robert had clearly planned this for a long time. Every financial detail had been arranged to protect himself. Another realization crept into my mind. Robert believed I had no leverage. He believed I didn't have the resources to hire powerful lawyers or challenge his strategy. To him, I was simply the quiet wife who taught art classes and lived a modest life. The woman who never cared much about money or status, and maybe that was exactly why he felt so confident. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from a number I didn't recognize. The text contained only a single line. "Mary Johnson, this is Thomas Reynolds. I handled the estate planning for your father, Edward Bennett. We need to speak as soon as possible." I stared at the message for a long moment. My father had passed away more than 20 years earlier. I hadn't spoken to any of his lawyers in decades. Why would one of them suddenly contact me now? And why did his message sound so urgent? At that moment, I assumed it was probably just some legal paperwork related to my father's old trust, maybe routine estate administration, maybe some minor financial detail. Compared to everything else happening in my life, it seemed like a small issue. So I set the phone down and tried to focus on the much bigger problem sitting in front of me, the divorce papers. Robert Johnson believed he had already won. He believed he had carefully calculated every possible outcome. He believed he was walking away with his wealth, his young girlfriend, and a clean legal victory. And sitting there at my kitchen table staring at those documents, I believed something too. I believed my life had just fallen apart. What I didn't know, what Robert definitely didn't know. Was that the quiet message from a lawyer named Thomas Reynolds was about to reveal a truth that would change everything? After the courier left and the house fell quiet again, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time staring at the documents Robert's lawyers had sent. The neat stack of papers looked harmless enough, but every page represented something real. Our home, our savings, our future, or at least what used to be our future. I read through the settlement proposal again more slowly this time. Robert's strategy was painfully clear. He had positioned almost everything under his professional financial structures. As a corporate attorney, he understood the legal system better than most people. He knew exactly how to structure assets in ways that would make them difficult to divide in a divorce. I couldn't even pretend to be surprised. Robert had always been careful with money, strategic, calculating. That was one of the things that made him successful in his career. For most of our marriage, I admired that quality. Now I realized it had probably been protecting him all along. A few hours later, I found myself standing in the small art studio at the back of the house. The room had always been my quiet place. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating the half-finished canvases leaning against the walls. Paintbrushes rested in glass jars on the work table, exactly where I had left them a few days earlier. Nothing in the room had changed, and yet everything felt different. I picked up one of the brushes absent-mindedly and ran my fingers along the wooden handle. For years, Robert had joked about my art. Not in a cruel way exactly. Just dismissively. "You should sell some of these," he used to say. "Maybe you'll finally contribute something to the household." At the time, I always laughed it off. Robert's world was full of billable hours, legal negotiations, and million-dollar corporate deals. My world was paint color and teaching kids at the community center how to express themselves creatively. We lived in different universes, but somehow for nearly 3 decades those universes had managed to coexist. At least I thought they had. Now I wondered how long Robert had secretly believed that my life, my passions, my work were insignificant. The buzzing of my phone pulled me back to reality. It was the same unfamiliar number from earlier, Thomas Reynolds, the lawyer who claimed to have worked for my father. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call. My emotional energy was already stretched thin. The last thing I wanted was to deal with some old legal matter from decades ago. But curiosity won. I answered. "Hello," Mary Johnson, the voice on the other end, asked. "Yes. This is Thomas Reynolds. I'm very sorry to contact you under such difficult circumstances. His tone was calm, professional, but there was a seriousness behind his words that immediately caught my attention. You mentioned my father in your message, I said cautiously. Yes, he replied. I worked with Edward Bennett for many years. Hearing my father's name spoken by a stranger felt oddly unsettling. My father had been gone for more than 20 years, but memories of him still lived quietly in the back of my mind. Edward Bennett had always been a complicated man, private, thoughtful, and incredibly careful about money. Growing up, I never understood exactly what he did for a living. He described himself simply as an investor. He traveled, often read financial reports constantly, and spoke about markets and businesses in ways that sounded like a completely different language. But despite his professional life, he had always been a kind father, patient, protective. When he passed away unexpectedly, I was only 32 years old. At the time, I believed his financial situation had been comfortable but modest. He left me a trust that provided regular payments enough to live without worry, but certainly not enough to be considered wealthy. Robert had often complained about that. He must have had more money than that Robert once said years ago. Investors don't usually leave such small estates, but I never questioned it. My father had been careful with money, and I assumed he simply chose to structure things conservatively. What exactly is this about? I asked Thomas. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mary, he said gently, are you currently going through divorce proceedings with Robert Johnson? The question startled me. Yes, I replied slowly. But how do you know that? My firm monitors certain legal developments related to your financial status, he explained. That sentence confused me even more. My financial status? Yes. The seriousness in his voice made me straighten slightly in my chair. Mr. Reynolds, I don't understand. I imagine you don't, he said quietly. Another pause followed. Then he asked a question that felt strangely important. Has Robert Johnson already filed for divorce, or is the process still informal? He filed, I said. I received the documents today. Thomas exhaled slowly. Then we need to meet. Something about the way he said those words made my pulse quicken. Why, I asked. Because the timing of your divorce has significant legal implications regarding the trust your father established. Trust. The word sounded familiar. My father had mentioned it years ago when I first began receiving those regular payments, but it had always seemed straightforward. A financial arrangement designed to provide stable income. Nothing more. What kind of implications? I asked. I would prefer to explain that in person, Thomas said carefully. His tone was respectful but firm. Mary, this is not something I should discuss over the phone. I looked around the quiet studio, suddenly aware of how little I actually understood about my father's financial affairs. All right, I said slowly. When? Tomorrow morning if possible. That soon? Yes. His urgency was impossible to ignore. Is something wrong? I asked. No, he replied after a brief pause. Not wrong, just important. Important. That word lingered in my mind long after the call ended. The next morning, I drove across town to the address Thomas Reynolds had given me. The building was located in one of San Diego's financial districts, tall glass towers filled with law firms, investment companies, and corporate offices. Definitely not the kind of place I usually visited. When I entered the lobby, the polished marble floors and quiet professionalism of the space made me feel slightly out of place. I checked in with the receptionist who directed me to the 32nd floor. Thomas Reynolds was waiting in a large conference room when I arrived. He was older than I expected, probably in his late 60s, with silver hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent decades practicing law. Mary, he said warmly as he stood up, thank you for coming. He gestured for me to sit. As I took the chair across from him, I noticed a thick folder sitting on the table. My name was printed neatly on the front. Before we begin, Thomas said carefully, I want you to understand that your father loved you very much. The statement caught me off guard. I know he did, I replied softly. Thomas nodded. Yes, and everything he did financially was designed to protect you. Protect me. The word sounded strange. My father passed away 20 years ago, I said. How could anything he arranged back then affect what's happening now? Thomas opened the folder slowly. Edward Bennett was a very intelligent man, he said, and he was also very cautious when it came to the people in your life. A quiet tension filled the room. What do you mean? I asked. Thomas looked directly into my eyes. Your father had serious concerns about Robert Johnson long before your marriage. The statement stunned me. That can't be right, I said quickly. My father liked Robert. Thomas didn't argue. Instead, he calmly slid a document across the table toward me. "You should read this," he said. I looked down at the paper. At the top was a familiar signature. Edward Bennett, my father. And underneath it, a series of legal terms that I didn't yet understand. But I had a growing feeling that whatever those documents contained, they were about to change everything I believed about my life. I stared at the document Thomas Reynolds had slid across the table. My father's signature sat clearly at the bottom of the page, written in the same elegant handwriting I remembered from birthday cards and old letters. For a moment, the conference room around me seemed to fade away. It felt like I was sitting with a ghost from my past. "This is part of the trust agreement your father established," Thomas explained gently. I glanced up at him. "I already know about the trust," I said. "It provides the monthly payments I've received since he passed away." Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, that's the portion of the trust you were meant to know about." The way he emphasized those words made my stomach tighten. "Meant to know about," I repeated. Thomas folded his hands on the table. "Mary, what you've been receiving for the past 20 years is only a very small component of a much larger structure." A quiet silence settled between us. "A larger structure?" I asked. "Yes." He turned another page inside the folder and placed it beside the first document. The heading read, ****, Bennett Holdings, Trust Agreement, ****. I frowned slightly. "Bennett Holdings?" I asked. Thomas studied my face carefully as if measuring how much information I could absorb at once. "Your father founded Bennett Holdings over 40 years ago," he said. I blinked. "Founded?" "Yes." I leaned back slightly in my chair, trying to process that sentence. "My father told me he was an investor," I said. Thomas gave a small, knowing smile. "He was." He tapped the document gently. "But he was also much more than that." He paused briefly before continuing. "Edward Bennett built Bennett Holdings as a private investment company. Over the decades, it quietly acquired stakes in dozens of businesses across multiple industries." I felt a strange sense of disorientation. The father I remembered had been thoughtful and private, but he had never talked about running a major investment firm. "How large was this company?" I asked. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the folder again and removed another set of documents. "These are current financial summaries," he said. He slid them toward me. My eyes moved slowly across the numbers printed on the page. For a moment, they didn't make sense. The figures were simply too large. I read the first number again, then again, and suddenly my heart began beating faster. "This can't be right," I said quietly. Thomas remained calm. "It is. But these numbers, they represent the current estimated value of Bennett Holdings' global investment portfolio." I looked up at him. "How much?" Thomas held my gaze for a moment before answering. "Just over $2 billion. The room went completely silent. $2 billion. I had never even spoken numbers like that out loud before. It was the kind of wealth you read about in financial magazines or saw mentioned in news articles about tech founders and billionaires, not something connected to my quiet, reserved father. "There must be some mistake," I said. "There isn't." I shook my head slowly. "If my father owned a company worth that much, why didn't I know about it?" Thomas's expression softened. "Because he deliberately arranged it that way. Why would he hide something like this from me?" Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Your father believed that sudden wealth can distort people's lives. He wanted you to live normally without the pressure and complications that extreme wealth often brings." That explanation made some sense. But it still left too many questions unanswered. Then why tell me now, I asked. Thomas placed another document in front of me. "This is where your current situation becomes relevant." I glanced down. The heading read, ****, Activation Clause, Primary Beneficiary, ****. "I don't understand," I said. Thomas spoke carefully. "When your father created the trust, he included several conditions regarding when you would receive full control of the Bennett Holdings assets." "Conditions?" "Yes." I felt my pulse quicken slightly. "What kind of conditions?" Thomas took a slow breath. "The most important one involves your marital status." "My marriage," I said. "Yes." He tapped the page gently. "According to the terms of the trust, full financial control of Bennett Holdings transfers to you under two circumstances." I waited. "Either your husband passes away," he paused briefly, "or your marriage legally ends." For a moment, I couldn't speak. "You're saying?" I began slowly. "Yes," Thomas said. The trust becomes fully accessible to you once Robert Johnson no longer has legal claim as your spouse. My mind struggled to keep up with what he was telling me. So as long as I was married, you only received the limited monthly distributions he confirmed. And now that Robert filed for divorce, Thomas gave a small nod. The trust's activation conditions have been triggered. A strange wave of disbelief washed over me. You're telling me that once the divorce is finalized? Thomas finished the sentence for me. You become the controlling beneficiary of Bennett Holdings. My voice felt almost distant as I asked the next question. And that means? It means Thomas said calmly that you will gain full legal ownership of assets currently valued at approximately $2 billion. $2 billion. The number echoed in my mind like something unreal. For 20 years, I had believed my father left me a modest trust designed to provide financial stability. In reality, he had built an entire financial empire and placed it quietly in my name. But why structure it this way, I asked softly. Thomas looked thoughtful. Your father was a careful observer of people. That doesn't answer my question. No, he admitted, but it's part of the answer. He opened another section of the folder. These are letters your father left for specific situations. My heart skipped slightly. He wrote letters for different circumstances. Yes. Thomas slid one envelope toward me. It was sealed. On the front in my father's handwriting were the words, **** for Mary. If her marriage ends, ****. Seeing those words made something tighten in my chest. My father expected this, I asked quietly. Thomas chose his words carefully. I believe he wanted to prepare for every possibility. I picked up the envelope slowly. My fingers traced the familiar handwriting. For a moment, memories of my father filled my mind. His quiet voice, his thoughtful advice, the way he always seemed to understand people better than they understood themselves. What happens now, I asked. Thomas answered calmly. The divorce process must be completed legally. And after that, once the court finalizes your divorce, the trust will transfer control of Bennett Holdings directly to you. I leaned back in my chair again. Somewhere in the city outside the tall windows, people were walking through their normal daily routines. Buying coffee, heading to work, living ordinary lives. And yet here I was, sitting in a conference room, learning that the life I believed I understood was built on a secret worth billions of dollars. What about Robert? I asked quietly. Thomas met my eyes. That is precisely why your father structured the trust this way. I frowned. What do you mean? Thomas closed the folder slowly. As long as you were married, Robert Johnson could potentially have claimed a portion of Bennett Holdings through marital asset laws. The realization hit me instantly. So my father protected the company. Yes, and protected you. A strange feeling spread through my chest. All those years I had assumed my father simply left behind a small financial cushion. In reality, he had spent decades carefully designing a system that would protect me from exactly the kind of situation I was now facing. But Robert doesn't know any of this, I said. Thomas shook his head. No, and he won't. That depends entirely on you. The room fell quiet again. For the first time since Robert handed me those divorce papers, I realized something extraordinary. The man who believed he was leaving an ordinary woman behind had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. For several minutes after Thomas Reynolds finished explaining the trust, I couldn't say a word. $2 billion. Even thinking the number felt surreal. I had spent most of my adult life living modestly. I taught art classes at a community center 3 afternoons a week. I bought groceries without thinking twice about sales and coupons. I drove the same car for nearly 10 years because it still worked perfectly fine. And now this calm, soft-spoken lawyer was telling me that technically, I was one of the wealthiest people in the city. It didn't feel real. I think you should read your father's letter, Thomas said gently. I looked down at the envelope again. The handwriting was unmistakable. Edward Bennett had always written carefully, each letter neat and deliberate. My hands felt strangely unsteady as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I unfolded it slowly. The letter began simply. Asterisk, my dear Mary asterisk. Asterisk. If you are reading this letter, it means your marriage has ended. The words made my chest tighten. Asterisk. First, I want you to know that I am sorry. Asterisk. No father ever wants to imagine his daughter experiencing heartbreak. I swallowed quietly and kept reading. Asterisk. But I have lived long enough to understand something important about people. Asterisk love can be genuine, but money has a way of revealing truths that would otherwise remain hidden. I paused for a moment. The room was completely silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Thomas sat patiently across the table, giving me the space to read. Asterisk. When you first introduced me to Robert Johnson, I saw a man who was intelligent, ambitious, and capable. Asterisk. Those are not bad qualities. Asterisk. But I also saw something else. I felt my fingers tighten slightly on the paper. Asterisk. I saw a man who measured his value and the value of others through success and status. Asterisk. That kind of thinking can be dangerous inside a marriage. I could almost hear my father's calm voice in those sentences. He had always been observant, quietly perceptive in ways that sometimes made people uncomfortable. Asterisk. I did not oppose your marriage because I believed that people can grow. Asterisk. But I also believed it was my responsibility to protect you if that growth never happened. My throat felt dry as I continued reading. Asterisk. That is why I created the Bennett Holdings Trust. Asterisk. The assets were never meant to control your life. Asterisk. They were meant to give you freedom if you ever needed it. Freedom. The word lingered in my mind. Asterisk. If Robert proved to be the partner you deserved, you would both eventually benefit from the company's success. Asterisk, but if he did not. The sentence trailed off for a moment. Asterisk. Then the trust would ensure that no one could ever use your kindness or your patience as a weakness. I lowered the paper slightly. For years, Robert had made subtle comments about my father's financial arrangements. He could have helped us more. Robert once complained after learning about the modest trust payments I received. If he had that much money, why hide it? At the time, I assumed my father had simply been cautious. Now I understood something deeper. He hadn't been hiding the money from me. He had been protecting it from the wrong person. I continued reading. Asterisk. If your marriage has ended, I want you to remember something very important. Asterisk. You are stronger than you think. Asterisk. The money you now control is not the most valuable thing I leave behind. Asterisk. Your independence is. My eyes blurred slightly for a moment. I took a slow breath and read the final lines. Asterisk. One day, the right person will come into your life. Asterisk. And that person will value you long before they ever know what you are worth. Asterisk. Until that day, live freely. Asterisk. Love your life. Asterisk. And never forget that you deserve honesty. Asterisk. With all my love. Asterisk. Asterisk. Dad. Asterisk. I lowered the letter slowly. For a long moment, I simply sat there staring at the paper. Memories of my father filled my mind, quiet evenings, talking about life. The thoughtful advice he used to offer, the way he always seemed to understand situations before anyone else did, even situations decades into the future. He loved you very much, Thomas said softly. I nodded. I know. Another thought suddenly surfaced. Did my father really distrust Robert that much? Thomas considered the question carefully. I don't think distrust is the right word, he said. What is the right word? Concern. He folded his hands calmly. Edward Bennett had extraordinary instincts when it came to people. In business, those instincts helped him build an incredibly successful investment firm. And in my marriage, I asked quietly. Thomas hesitated. In your marriage, he simply wanted to make sure you were protected. I leaned back slightly in my chair. So the trust activates once the divorce is finalized. Yes. And then what happens? Thomas opened the folder again and pulled out several additional documents. Once the court legally dissolves your marriage, control of Bennett Holdings transfers entirely to you. Control, I repeated. Yes, he pointed to one of the documents. You will become the primary shareholder and controlling executive authority. That sounds like a lot of responsibility. It is. A faint smile crossed his face. But you won't be alone. He turned another page. Bennett Holdings already has a management team that has been overseeing daily operations for years. Who runs it now? A man named Daniel Brooks. He's been acting as the company's executive director since your father passed away. I frowned slightly. Why haven't I heard about any of this before? Because that was your father's request. Thomas leaned back slightly. He wanted you to live your life normally until the trust conditions were met. I glanced down at the financial summaries again. $2 billion. The number still didn't feel real. What happens if Robert finds out? I asked. Thomas's expression remained calm. The trust is legally structured as a separate entity created before your marriage, so he can't claim any of it. No. And if he tries, Thomas allowed himself a small, confident smile. Then Robert Johnson will discover that your father was not only careful, he was extremely thorough. I couldn't help letting out a quiet breath. For the first time since Robert handed me those divorce papers, the helplessness I had felt began to fade. Instead, something else started to take its place: clarity. Robert believed he had carefully planned every detail of this divorce. He believed he had arranged his finances in ways that would leave me with very little. He believed he was walking away from our marriage with his career, his penthouse apartment, and his young influencer girlfriend. And perhaps most importantly, he believed he was leaving behind an ordinary woman who had no real power. But sitting in that quiet conference room holding my father's letter in my hands, I realized something extraordinary. Robert Johnson had absolutely no idea that the woman he was divorcing was about to become a billionaire. When I walked out of Thomas Reynolds' office that afternoon, the city felt strangely unfamiliar. San Diego looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Cars moving through the streets, people walking with coffee cups in their hands, the ocean breeze drifting through the downtown buildings. But something fundamental inside my life had shifted. For 20 years, I had believed I understood the limits of my world. My father had left me a modest trust. My husband had built a successful legal career. Our life together had been comfortable, predictable, ordinary. Now I knew that none of those assumptions were true. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. My father's letter rested in my lap. His words replayed quietly in my mind. Asterisk. The money you now control is not the most valuable thing I leave behind. Asterisk. Your independence is independence. For years, I had never questioned the balance of power inside my marriage. Robert earned the large income. Robert managed most of our finances. Robert made many of the bigger decisions about investments and long-term planning. I trusted him. That trust had felt natural at the time. Now I wondered how much of my life I had quietly handed over to someone else without realizing it. My phone buzzed suddenly on the passenger seat. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't expected to see again so soon. Robert. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call, but something inside me wanted to hear his voice again. Maybe to understand who he had become. Maybe to remind myself that the man who had ended our marriage so casually was still very real. I answered, "Hello, Mary." His tone sounded almost casual, as if we were discussing something routine. "I wanted to check whether you received the documents from my lawyer." I glanced down at the divorce papers sitting beside me. "Yes," I said calmly. "I received them." "Good." There was a short pause. "I assume you understand the terms." I read them. "They're fair," he said quickly. "My lawyer structured everything as cleanly as possible." Cleanly. That word again. I pictured Robert standing somewhere in his new penthouse apartment, confident that every detail of his plan had worked perfectly. "Mary," he said when I didn't respond immediately. "I'm here. You haven't contacted a lawyer yet, have you?" His question carried an edge of curiosity. And something else. Calculation. "No," I said simply. Another pause followed. "Honestly, Mary," he continued, "it would probably just complicate things if you did." I almost smiled at that. The quiet confidence in his voice was unmistakable. Robert truly believed I had no reason or ability to challenge the agreement. "You always preferred to keep life simple," he added. For years, that had been one of the ways he described me. Simple, uncomplicated, easygoing. Now I understood what he really meant. Predictable, safe, powerless. "Well," I said softly, "life seems to be changing in a lot of ways lately." Robert let out a brief laugh. "That's one way to put it." There was another pause before he spoke again. "I'm moving the rest of my things out this weekend." "That's fine. You don't need to be there if you'd rather avoid it." I looked at through the windshield at the busy street outside. "I won't be there." "Probably for the best," he said. Then he added something that surprised me slightly. "I hope we can keep this civilized." Civilized. The irony of that word wasn't lost on me. "You mean quiet," I said. "What?" "You want it to stay quiet." Robert hesitated for a moment. "I just don't see the point in unnecessary drama." Of course he didn't. Drama was inconvenient, messy, difficult to manage, especially when someone believed they had already won. "I'll review the documents," I said calmly. "My lawyer will need your response by the end of next week." "All right." The conversation ended a few seconds later. As I set the phone down again, a strange calm settled over me. The pain from the night before was still there, but it had changed. It no longer felt like the crushing weight of betrayal. Instead, it felt like distance. The kind of emotional distance that comes when you suddenly see a person clearly for the first time. Robert had spent years believing he understood me completely. He believed he knew exactly what I was capable of. But the truth was, he had never really bothered to look closely. Later that evening, I drove back to the house. The familiar driveway felt different now, not because the house itself had changed, but because the life I associated with it was already fading. Inside, everything looked exactly the same. Robert's books still lined the shelves in the living room. The framed photographs from our vacation still hung on the walls, but his presence was gone. I walked slowly through the rooms, noticing details I had ignored for years. The way Robert's office desk was always perfectly organized. The expensive watches he kept in a small display case. The leather chair where he used to sit reading legal documents late at night. All the small symbols of a life built around ambition and success. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table. My father's letter rested beside me. For a long time, I simply looked at it. One question kept repeating in my mind. Did my father truly see this coming? Had he predicted that my marriage would eventually fall apart? Or had he simply prepared for the possibility because that was the kind of man he was, careful, thoughtful, always thinking 10 steps ahead? I imagined him sitting in a quiet office decades ago working with lawyers to build a financial structure that would only reveal itself under very specific circumstances. Circumstances that had just happened to occur. My divorce. The irony of it all was almost unbelievable. Robert had spent months planning his exit from our marriage. He believed he had arranged everything perfectly. He had the new apartment, the young girlfriend, the legal documents designed to protect his assets, and yet the one thing he hadn't planned for was the quiet financial empire my father had built decades earlier, an empire that Robert couldn't touch, an empire that would soon belong entirely to me. I picked up the letter again and reread the final lines. Asterisk, one day the right person will come into your life. Asterisk, and that person will value you long before they ever know what you are worth. For the first time since Robert walked out the door, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not sadness, but clarity. My father hadn't just protected money, he had protected me. And very soon the man who believed he had taken everything from me was going to discover just how wrong he had been. The following week moved in a strange blur of routine and quiet revelations. On the surface, nothing dramatic happened. Robert's lawyer sent a few formal emails reminding me about the timeline for responding to the divorce agreement. The legal language remained polite and professional, but the message behind it was clear. Robert expected the process to move quickly, cleanly, exactly the way he liked things. But behind the scenes, my world was changing faster than he could possibly imagine. 2 days after meeting Thomas Reynolds, I returned to his office again. This time he introduced me to another man. Mary Thomas said as we entered a conference room, "I'd like you to meet Daniel Brooks." The man standing by the window turned and offered a warm handshake. Daniel Brooks looked to be in his early 50s. He had the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making important decisions, but his demeanor was calm rather than intimidating. "It's nice to finally meet you," he said. "Finally?" I asked. Daniel smiled slightly. "I've been working for your family for almost 15 years. That sentence caught my attention immediately. You worked for my father. Toward the end of his life, yes. And after he passed away, I became the managing director of Bennett Holdings." Managing director. So this was the man who had been running the company that my father secretly built. The company that now somehow belonged to me. We sat down at the long conference table. Daniel opened a tablet and pulled up several documents. "I know this is a lot to absorb," he said. "So today I want to walk you through how the company currently operates." For the next hour, he explained the structure of Bennett Holdings. The company wasn't a single business. It was a network of investments, technology startups in California, medical research companies on the East Coast, commercial real estate in several major cities, even minority stakes in international manufacturing firms. The more Daniel explained, the more unbelievable it felt. My father had quietly built one of the most diversified investment portfolios I had ever heard of. And he had done it without ever drawing public attention. "Your father believed strongly in privacy," Daniel said. "That's an understatement," I replied. Daniel laughed softly. He used to say that the moment people start talking about your wealth is the moment you lose control of it. That sounded exactly like something my father would say. But why didn't he tell me any of this, I asked. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Thomas Reynolds before answering. Because he didn't want the money to define your life. I thought about that. My father had watched many wealthy families lose themselves in their fortunes. Children who grew up without purpose. Marriages built on financial convenience instead of real connection. Perhaps he had simply wanted something better for me. So what happens now, I asked. Daniel tapped a document on the screen. Once your divorce is finalized, the trust transfers full control of Bennett Holdings to you. And then, you become the majority shareholder and executive authority. The title sounded enormous. Does that mean I'm expected to run the company? I asked cautiously. Daniel shook his head. Not unless you want to. He leaned back slightly in his chair. Bennett Holdings already has a professional management team handling daily operations. So what would my role be? You set the direction. You make major decisions about long-term strategy. I considered that quietly. It was strange to imagine myself making decisions about companies and investments worth millions of dollars. Just a week earlier, my biggest professional decision had been whether to add an extra art workshop for the kids at the community center. Life had changed very quickly. Daniel seemed to sense my hesitation. You don't need to rush anything, he said. Your father structured this so that you could take control gradually. Thomas nodded in agreement. The most important thing right now is simply completing the legal requirements. The divorce, I said. Yes. I thought about Robert for a moment. He still believed I was the same woman he had dismissed so easily. The quiet art teacher, the predictable wife, the person who would quietly sign whatever agreement he placed in front of her. He had no idea that the entire financial balance of our situation had already shifted. Robert doesn't know about any of this, I said. No, Thomas confirmed. And legally, he doesn't need to. Daniel folded his hands thoughtfully. Once the divorce is finalized, the assets transfer directly through the trust structure. And Robert can't challenge that. Thomas answered that question with quiet confidence. No. A faint sense of calm settled over me. For the first time since Robert had announced he was leaving, I realized something important. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to prove anything. All I needed to do was let the process unfold. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the house briefly to collect a few things before Robert came to move the rest of his belongings. The driveway was empty when I arrived. Inside the house felt quieter than ever. Several of Robert's shelves had already been cleared. The closet in our bedroom was half empty. The physical signs of our marriage were slowly disappearing. As I walked through the hallway, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a notification from Laura. She had sent me another Instagram link. I hesitated before opening it. But curiosity won. The post was from Chloe Carter again. In the photo, she and Robert were sitting at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the ocean. She was smiling brightly, holding a glass of champagne. Robert looked relaxed, almost proud. The caption read, asterisk, when life gives you the courage to choose happiness. New chapter, asterisk. I stared at the image for a moment. Just a few days ago, that post might have shattered me. Now it felt strangely distant, almost irrelevant. Robert believed he had traded an ordinary life for something more exciting, more glamorous, more ambitious. But the truth was, he didn't yet realize the scale of what he had just walked away from. And perhaps the strangest part of all was this. I wasn't planning to tell him, at least not yet. Because sometimes the most powerful moments in life aren't the ones where you fight back loudly. Sometimes they're the moments when you simply wait and let the truth reveal itself. Very soon, Robert Johnson was going to learn exactly who he had left behind. 3 weeks later, my divorce from Robert Johnson became official. It happened in the most ordinary way imaginable. No dramatic courtroom scene, no emotional speeches, just a quiet hearing inside a modest San Diego courthouse. The judge reviewed the documents, asked a few routine questions, and then signed the final order dissolving our marriage. 27 years together ended in less than 20 minutes. When the hearing finished, Robert stood up from his chair without even looking in my direction. He wore the same confident expression he had carried since the day he handed me those divorce papers. To him, this moment represented a victory. He had achieved exactly what he wanted. A clean exit, a younger partner, a future he believed would be more exciting than the life we had built together. For a brief second, our eyes met across the courtroom. There was no anger in his face, no regret, just quiet satisfaction. He gave a small nod, almost like someone acknowledging the end of a business negotiation. Then he turned and walked out. I watched him disappear through the courtroom doors. It was strange. I had expected that moment to hurt. But instead I felt something entirely different. Relief, not because my marriage had ended, but because a chapter of my life that no longer belonged to me had finally closed. Thomas Reynolds was waiting outside in the hallway when I stepped out. "Well," he said gently, "that's it." "That's it," I repeated. He studied my face carefully. "How are you feeling?" I considered the question. "Surprisingly calm." Thomas smiled slightly. "That's a good sign." He handed me a small folder. "These are copies of the court documents confirming the final judgment." I accepted them. "Does this mean the trust?" Thomas nodded. "Yes." For the first time, the reality of what was about to happen truly settled in my mind. My father's financial structure, the one he had designed decades earlier, had just reached the moment he planned for. My divorce had activated the final condition. "So what happens now?" I asked. Thomas glanced at his watch. "Well," he said, "technically speaking, it's already happening." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Thomas gestured toward the elevators. "Come with me." We rode down to the parking garage in silence. Once inside the car, Thomas pulled out his phone and opened a financial application. "Take a look at this," he said, handing the screen to me. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Rows of numbers, account names, financial institutions. Then my eyes landed on the balance line. For a moment, my brain refused to process it. $2,048,000,000. I blinked, then looked again. The number hadn't changed. "That's..." I whispered. "Yes," Thomas said calmly. "The Bennett Holdings Trust has officially transferred control." The amount displayed on the screen represented the consolidated value of the investment accounts now legally connected to my name. $2 billion. Just like that. No fireworks. No dramatic announcement. Just a quiet digital confirmation. I felt a strange wave of disbelief. "So this is real?" I asked. "Very real." Thomas took the phone back and closed the application. Over the next few weeks, there will be a series of formal transitions, corporate filings, board confirmations, things like that. "And Daniel Brooks?" I asked. "He's already preparing the internal announcement." "Announcement?" "Yes." Thomas looked amused. "After all, the company has a new owner." "Owner?" The word felt strange. Only a month ago, I had been worrying about whether I could afford a good divorce attorney. Now I was technically the controlling authority over an international investment firm. Life had a strange sense of timing. Later that afternoon, I drove back toward the house one final time. The divorce agreement required that I vacate the property within 30 days. Robert had already arranged to take ownership. It seemed fitting. The house had always been more connected to his world than mine. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something new. A delivery truck parked nearby. 2 movers were carrying furniture inside. For a moment, I assumed Robert had come early to move more of his belongings. But when I stepped out of the car, I saw something unexpected. Chloe Carter stood near the front door directing the movers. She looked exactly like she did in her Instagram photos. Perfect hair, perfect clothes, perfect confidence. She noticed me walking up the driveway and froze for a second. Then she offered an awkward smile. "Oh, hi." Her voice carried the slightly uncertain tone of someone caught off guard. "Hello," I said politely. She shifted her weight uncomfortably. "I didn't realize you'd be here today." "I'm just collecting a few things," I replied. Chloe glanced back toward the house. "Well, Robert said the place would technically be his now." "Yes," I said calmly, "it will be." Another brief silence followed. For someone who seemed so confident online, Chloe suddenly looked very young standing there in person, almost nervous. "I know this must be awkward," she said carefully. "It's fine." She studied my face as if trying to read my reaction. "I didn't expect things to happen this fast," she added. Fast. I almost laughed at that. Robert had spent an entire year preparing for this moment. Fast was not the word I would use. "I hope everything works out for you," I said politely. Chloe seemed relieved by the calmness of my response. "Thank you," she said. Just then, Robert stepped out of the house behind her. When he saw me standing in the driveway, he paused briefly. "Mary," he said. "Robert." He walked down the steps slowly. "I thought you were picking up your things tomorrow." I finished early at the courthouse. His eyes flickered with mild curiosity. "Oh, right, the hearing today." "Yes." "How did it go?" "It's finalized." Robert nodded. "Well, that's good." There was something almost strange about how normal the conversation felt, like 2 acquaintances discussing routine paperwork. "I hope everything works out for you," he said. The exact same sentence Chloe had used minutes earlier. "Thank you," I replied. For a moment, Robert seemed about to say something else. But then he simply nodded and turned back toward the house. As I walked inside to collect the last few boxes of my belongings, I couldn't help noticing something quietly ironic. Robert Johnson believed he had just secured his new life, the penthouse, the influencer girlfriend, the freedom he had been planning for months. He believed the divorce marked the beginning of his next chapter. What he didn't realize was that on the exact same day he finalized our marriage's end, the woman he left behind had just become a billionaire, and very soon the world was going to find out. The news broke 3 days later. I didn't even know it was coming. That morning started like any other. I had temporarily moved into a small rental apartment near the coast while I decided what to do next. It was modest compared to the house Robert had taken, but I actually liked it. The windows faced the ocean, and the sound of the waves rolling in each morning brought a quiet sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in years, my life felt strangely open. Uncertain, yes, but also full of possibilities. I was sitting at the kitchen counter drinking coffee when my phone started vibrating non-stop. At first, I ignored it. Then I noticed something unusual. 10 messages, then 15, then 20, all within a few minutes. Most of them were from people I hadn't heard from in months or even years. Former colleagues, old neighbors, parents of kids from the art classes I used to teach, even a few distant relatives. My first thought was that something terrible must have happened. Then Laura Mitchell called. "Mary," she said the moment I answered. "What's wrong?" I asked immediately. "Wrong," she repeated. "Are you kidding me? Turn on the news?" The news. Yes. I reached for my tablet and opened a financial news website. And there it was. A headline that made my heart stop for a second. Asterisk, asterisk. Bennett Holdings. Heiress Mary Johnson takes control of $2 billion investment empire. Asterisk, asterisk. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Underneath the headline was a photo of me. A photo I barely remembered being taken. It must have been from a charity art event years earlier. The article explained everything. After decades of operating quietly as a private investment firm founded by Edward Bennett, Bennett Holdings had officially confirmed a change in leadership. The company's new controlling shareholder, Mary Johnson, me. The article described the company's investment portfolio, its financial growth over the past 20 years, and the legal structure of the trust that had recently transferred ownership. It even mentioned that the transition had been triggered by the activation conditions outlined in the trust agreement. My divorce. "So, it's public now," I said quietly. "Oh, it's very public," Laura replied. "You're trending everywhere. Trending, financial media, business blogs, even some lifestyle sites." I scrolled further down the page. There were already multiple articles discussing the story. Some focused on my father's legacy. Others analyzed Bennett Holdings' investment strategy. A few mentioned the unusual trust structure that had kept the company largely out of the public spotlight for decades. One thing was clear. The secret my father had protected for 20 years was no longer a secret. "You should see the comments," Laura said. "I'm not sure I want to." "Well, here's the best part." Her voice suddenly sounded amused. "Robert definitely has." "What do you mean?" "Someone from his law firm shared the article internally this morning." I leaned back slowly in my chair. "His law firm?" "Yes." Laura laughed softly. "Mary, the entire legal community in San Diego is talking about this." I imagined Robert walking into his office that morning, expecting an ordinary day at work, maybe reviewing case files, maybe preparing for meetings, then suddenly seeing headlines about the woman he had just divorced, the woman he believed had no financial leverage, the woman he assumed would quietly accept the settlement he designed. Except now, the entire financial press was reporting that she controlled $2 billion. "I wonder how he reacted," Laura said. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I didn't need to wonder for very long. My phone buzzed again. "Robert Johnson." "Of course." I let it ring for a few seconds before answering. "Hello." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Robert spoke. "Mary." His voice sounded completely different from the calm, confident tone he used during our last conversation. This time it carried something else. Shock. "What is this?" he asked. I knew exactly what he meant. "What is what?" I replied calmly. "Don't play games with me," he said sharply. "I'm looking at an article right now that says you own Bennett Holdings." "Yes." Another pause followed. "That company is worth billions of dollars. That's what the article says. You're telling me this is real?" "Yes." The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds. When Robert spoke again, his voice sounded strained. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question was so absurd that I almost laughed. Tell you what. That you had this kind of money. I didn't know. You didn't know, he repeated. No. I could practically hear his mind trying to process the situation. You're telling me you suddenly discovered $2 billion. My father arranged the trust many years ago. Robert's breathing sounded heavier now. And this trust activates the moment we get divorced. Yes. Another long pause. So, if we were still married, you would have had legal claim to part of it, I said calmly. The realization must have hit him at that moment. Because when he spoke again, his voice sounded hollow. You're saying I just walked away from my father's company? $2 billion. I didn't say the number out loud. I didn't need to. Robert already knew. For a man who had spent his entire career negotiating high-stakes corporate deals, this was probably the worst miscalculation he had ever made. You should have told me, he said quietly. I thought about my father's letter, about the way he had carefully structured the trust to protect me, to reveal the truth only when the marriage ended. No, I said calmly. I really shouldn't have. Robert didn't respond, but I could almost hear the regret settling in. You need to talk to your lawyer, he said suddenly. Why? There has to be some kind of legal issue here. There isn't. This changes things, he insisted. Not legally. Another long silence followed. Then he asked the question I had been expecting. Mary, can we meet? I considered the request for a moment. Only a week earlier, Robert had spoken to me like a man closing a business deal he had already won. Now his voice carried uncertainty, even desperation. Why, I asked. I think we should talk. We already did. This is different. I looked out the window at the ocean waves rolling in the distance. No, I said quietly. It really isn't? Robert didn't speak for a moment. Then he asked one final question. Does Chloe know about this? I almost smiled. I imagine she does by now. Because if the financial press had picked up the story, social media certainly had too. And somewhere, in the city, the 24-year-old influencer who had proudly announced her new chapter online was probably reading the same headlines. Headlines that revealed a very inconvenient truth. The man she believed was her wealthy new partner had just divorced the only billionaire in the story. Robert called again the next morning. I wasn't surprised. People like Robert rarely accept losing without trying to renegotiate the terms. The phone rang while I was standing on the small balcony of my rental apartment, watching the morning fog lift slowly off the ocean. For a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. Hello? Mary, he said immediately. His voice sounded very different from the confident man who had calmly handed me divorce papers only a few weeks earlier. There was tension there now. Urgency. I think we really need to talk, he continued. I thought we already did. This is serious. So was our marriage. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he exhaled slowly. I didn't know about the trust. I know, if I had known. I cut him off gently. That's exactly the point. There was a long silence on the line. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. Less demanding, more cautious. I made a mistake, he said. The words sounded almost unfamiliar coming from him. Robert Johnson was not a man who admitted mistakes easily. People make mistakes, I replied calmly. This was a big one. I didn't say anything, because there wasn't really anything to add to that statement. I've been thinking a lot about the past few weeks, he continued. Have you? Yes. And another pause. I think we rushed the divorce. I almost laughed out loud. We rushed it. Things moved quickly, he said carefully. You filed the papers. Yes, but... And you spent a year planning to leave. He didn't argue with that. I'm just saying, he continued. Maybe we should slow down and look at everything again. Robert. Yes. The divorce is final. I know. That means there's nothing to reconsider. That's not entirely true. Now I was curious. What do you mean? I spoke to my attorney this morning. Of course he had. And he believes there might be legal grounds to challenge the asset structure. I leaned back against the balcony railing. Based on what? Well, if the trust existed during our marriage, it might still qualify as a marital asset. I almost smiled. Thomas Reynolds had already predicted this exact argument. You should talk to your lawyer again, I said. I did. And he said the trust was created before our marriage. That's correct. And it's legally separate. Yes. Another pause. So, there's nothing I can do, he asked quietly. No. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy with everything that had changed between us. You could have told me, he said eventually. Why would I? Because we were married. We were married when you started dating Chloe, too. That ended the conversation for several seconds. I didn't expect this, he said finally. Neither did I. Mary, I'm serious about meeting. What for? I think we should talk face to face. I don't see the point. There are things I want to explain. You already explained them. That's not fair. I sighed softly. Robert, the explanation was very clear. Another pause followed. I'm not the same person I was a month ago, he said. That statement made me smile slightly. Neither am I. I mean it, he insisted. This situation, it's made me rethink a lot of things. Like what? Like whether I made the right decision. The irony of that sentence almost made me laugh. He hadn't doubted his decision when he stood in our kitchen and told me I lacked ambition. He hadn't doubted it when he posted photos with Chloe celebrating their new chapter. But now that he knew about the $2 billion, suddenly his decision felt less certain. Robert, I said calmly, you didn't leave because of money. No, you left because you thought your life would be better without me. That's exactly what you said. He didn't argue. People say things they regret, he said. That's true. And I regret a lot of things right now. Another long silence settled between us. Then he said something I hadn't expected. Chloe moved out. I blinked. That was fast. She didn't sign up for this kind of situation. What kind of situation? The kind where I look like the biggest idiot in California. I almost laughed again. For the first time since our divorce, Robert sounded genuinely self-aware. Social media can be brutal, I said. That's an understatement. He exhaled heavily. She saw the headlines. I imagine she did. Then she asked me if I knew about the trust. And I told her no. Another pause. She didn't believe me at first. I'm not surprised. I had to show her the divorce paperwork just to prove that I didn't know. And then she packed her things that night. I couldn't help shaking my head slightly. The woman who had proudly posted photos about her new life had apparently decided that life looked less appealing without the billionaire connection. I guess ambition works both ways, I said. Robert didn't respond. Then he asked quietly, did you know the trust would activate if we divorced? No. You found out after I filed? Yes. So the timing was just coincidence, pretty much. He let out a long breath. That might be the worst part. What is the fact that if I had waited another year or even a few months, you would have still been married to a billionaire? Yes, and I would have known. That's true. Another heavy silence followed. I'm sorry, he said finally. The words were soft, almost sincere, but they came far too late. I believe you are, I said. That doesn't change anything. No. The ocean waves continued rolling quietly below my balcony. A calm rhythm that felt strangely grounding. I suppose this is the part where you tell me everything worked out for the best, Robert said. I wasn't planning to. You're not? No. Why not? Because losing a 27-year marriage isn't exactly a happy ending. That statement hung in the air for a moment. But I added, it might be the beginning of something better. For you, yes. Robert didn't argue with that. I hope you're happy, Mary, he said quietly. I hope you learned something from this, I replied. Like what? That ambition and wisdom aren't always the same thing. Another pause followed. Then Robert gave a small, resigned laugh. That might be the most expensive lesson I've ever learned. $2 billion worth. I didn't say it out loud, but we both knew it. A week after the news about Bennett Holdings broke my life became unexpectedly busy, not because of the money itself, but because of the attention that followed it. Journalists called. Financial analysts requested interviews. Even a few television programs wanted to feature a story about the mysterious billionaire heiress who appeared overnight. The phrase made me laugh every time I heard it. Overnight. As if my father hadn't spent 40 years building the company that created that wealth. As if the trust hadn't been carefully structured decades ago. In reality, nothing about this situation had happened quickly. The only thing that changed overnight was public awareness. Daniel Brooks met me again at the Bennett Holdings office that Monday morning. The building itself was surprisingly modest for a company managing billions in investments. No flashy signs, no giant logos. Just a clean glass structure overlooking the harbor. My father would have liked that. Your father believed attention was a liability, Daniel explained, as we walked through the lobby. Most of our investors prefer the same philosophy. The office environment felt calm and professional. People moved through the hallways quietly focused on their work. No one stared or whispered when I walked by. That surprised me. Do they all know? I asked Daniel. Yes. And they're professionals, he said simply. Inside the conference room, the company's executive team was waiting. 6 people, each one responsible for a different division of the company's investments. Daniel introduced them one by one. Technology investments, healthcare research, real estate development, international markets. Every person in the room had years, sometimes decades of experience managing complex financial portfolios. I suddenly felt slightly out of place. I should probably say something obvious before we start, I said as we sat down. What's that? Daniel asked. I'm not a billionaire executive. A few people around the table smiled. That's all right, Daniel replied. Neither was your father when he started. The meeting lasted almost 2 hours. Most of the discussion focused on explaining the company's current investment positions and long-term strategies. I listened carefully, asking questions when something didn't make sense. To my surprise, the conversation felt natural. Perhaps it was because I had spent years listening to Robert talk about business and finance at dinner parties and social events. I had never actively participated in those discussions, but I had learned more than I realized. By the time the meeting ended, Daniel looked pleased. You handled that very well, he said as we walked toward his office. I mostly asked questions. That's exactly what good leadership looks like. Inside his office, Daniel poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to me. There's something else we should talk about, he said. What is it? Public perception. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds ominous. It's not, he assured me. But stories like yours attract attention, I've noticed, which means people will also start looking into your personal life. I understood what he meant immediately. Robert, Chloe, the divorce. I'm guessing reporters already know about my ex-husband, I said. Daniel nodded. Some of them do. And they're curious. Of course they were. A billionaire inheritance revealed immediately after a divorce was the kind of story journalists loved. It might get uncomfortable, Daniel added. I'll survive. He studied me for a moment. You seem remarkably calm about all of this. I thought about that. Maybe a month earlier, the attention would have overwhelmed me. But after everything that had already happened, the situation felt different. This isn't really about the money, I said. What do you mean? My father built something extraordinary. I looked around the office. I'd rather focus on protecting that. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. I think he would have liked hearing that. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the small art studio I used to teach at. The community center director, Mrs. Delgado, greeted me with a hug the moment I walked in. Mary, she said warmly, I was wondering if we'd ever see you again. I couldn't stay away forever. She looked at me carefully. So wait, is it true? I smiled slightly. Which part? The $2 billion. It's a little more complicated than that. Well, she said with a laugh, everyone here is very proud of you. Inside the classroom, several of the children I used to teach were working on watercolor paintings. One of them spotted me and ran over. Miss Mary. Hi, Ethan. Are you famous now? He asked excitedly. The question made me laugh. I don't think so. My mom said you're on the news. That doesn't make someone famous. It kind of does, he insisted. I knelt down beside his desk. What are you painting today? A whale. He proudly showed me the bright blue shape on his paper. For the next hour, I helped the kids finish their paintings, mixing colors, fixing small mistakes, encouraging them when their drawings didn't look exactly the way they imagined. It felt exactly like it always had. Peaceful, simple, normal. And strangely, that normalcy mattered more to me now than ever. When I finally left the community center, my phone buzzed again. A text message from an unknown number. I opened it cautiously. Asterisk, asterisk, Chloe Carter, asterisk, asterisk. The message was short. Asterisk, hi, Mary. I know this is probably the last person you expected to hear from, but I was hoping we could talk. I stared at the screen for a moment. The young woman who had proudly taken photos with my husband just weeks earlier was now asking to speak with me. Curiosity won again. I typed back, asterisk. About what asterisk? Her response came quickly. Asterisk, Robert, asterisk. Of course. Another message appeared seconds later. Asterisk. There are some things you should probably know. I looked at the ocean stretching out in front of me as I stood in the parking lot. Life had already taken several unexpected turns in the past month. Something told me this conversation might reveal yet another one. I didn't respond to Chloe's message right away. For a few minutes, I simply stood in the parking lot outside the community center, staring at my phone. The situation felt almost surreal. Just a month earlier, Chloe Carter had been the woman celebrating her new life with my husband on social media. Now she was asking to talk to me about him. Life had a strange sense of irony. Eventually, curiosity won. Asterisk. What do you want to talk about, asterisk, I typed. Her reply came almost instantly. Asterisk. Can we meet somewhere? I promise I'm not trying to cause trouble. I hesitated. Every rational part of my mind said this conversation probably wasn't necessary. My marriage to Robert was over. The divorce was finalized. Whatever relationship Chloe had with him was no longer my concern. But another part of me, perhaps the same part that had agreed to meet Thomas Reynolds weeks earlier, felt compelled to hear what she had to say. Asterisk, 1 hour asterisk, I replied. There's a coffee shop near the harbor. Her response came back quickly. Asterisk, thank you. When I arrived at the cafe, Chloe was already there. Without the carefully staged lighting and filters of social media, she looked younger than I expected, almost nervous. She stood up when I approached the table. Hi, she said awkwardly. Hello. For a moment, neither of us seemed sure how to begin this conversation. Finally, she gestured toward the chair across from her. Thank you for coming. I sat down. You said there were things I should know. Chloe nodded, twisting the sleeve of her sweater nervously. I know you probably hate me. I don't hate you. That surprised her. You don't? No. She frowned slightly. Why not? Because I don't think you were the real problem. That answer seemed to catch her off guard. She looked down at the table for a moment before speaking again. I broke up with Robert. I heard. He told you. No. Then how? It wasn't difficult to guess. Chloe let out a small, embarrassed laugh. Yeah, I guess the headlines didn't help. The waitress arrived briefly to take our drink orders. When she left, Chloe leaned forward slightly. I didn't know about the money, she said quickly. I assumed that. I mean it, she insisted. Robert told me you had a small trust from your father, but that was it. That's what I believed too. She studied my face carefully. So when the news came out, that was the first time you realized how much the company was worth. Yes. Chloe nodded slowly. That must have been shocking. It was. She took a sip of her coffee before continuing. Robert completely lost it when he saw the article. I can imagine. He spent the entire night calling lawyers. That sounds like him. Chloe hesitated before saying the next part. He thought he could get the divorce reversed. I couldn't help smiling slightly. That's not how divorces work. That's what his attorney told him too. She paused. Mary Asigai didn't contact you to defend Robert. Then why did you contact me? Chloe took a deep breath. Because you should know something about the last few months. My curiosity sharpened. What kind of something? She looked directly into my eyes. Robert didn't just leave you for me. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? He left because he thought you had nothing. The words hung quietly between us. I figured that out already, I said, calmly. Chloe shook her head. No. I mean, he really believed it. I'm not sure I understand the difference. She leaned back in her chair. For the past year, Robert talked constantly about how frustrating your life was. My life? He said you had no ambition, no interest in success. That sounds familiar. He told me he spent years trying to push you to do something bigger. I almost laughed. Robert had never pushed me toward anything except supporting his own career. And he thought leaving you would prove something, Chloe continued. Prove what? That he deserved more. I watched the harbor outside the cafe window for a moment. Boats moved slowly across the water. People walked along the docks enjoying the afternoon sun. Life outside the cafe felt calm and ordinary. Inside, Chloe was explaining the quiet arrogance that had ended my marriage. He thought he was upgrading his life, she said bluntly. I'm aware. He also believed he was the successful one in the relationship. That statement didn't surprise me at all. For years, Robert's identity had been built around his career achievements, his law firm, his clients, his financial success. In his mind, those things defined value. So when the headlines came out, Chloe said carefully, he realized he was wrong. Yes, she hesitated. But that's not the only reason I wanted to talk to you. What else? Chloe looked uncomfortable again. Robert has been telling people something. What kind of something? He's saying you knew about the trust before the divorce. I frowned. That's not true. I know. But he's trying to convince people that you tricked him. The accusation didn't make me angry. It simply made me tired. That's easier for him to believe, I said quietly. Easier than what? Admitting he made a mistake. Chloe nodded slowly. That's what I thought too. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. There's something else you should see. She turned the screen toward me. It was a message thread. Several messages from Robert. I scanned them quickly. At first they seemed ordinary. But then I noticed something. Robert wasn't just complaining about the divorce. He was planning something. Another lawsuit. Another attempt to challenge the trust. Another attempt to claim part of the company. He thinks he can prove you hid assets, Chloe said quietly. I looked up at her. Why are you showing me this? She hesitated. Because I realized something after everything happened. What? Chloe shrugged slightly. I realized Robert didn't really care about me either. That wasn't surprising. He only cared about winning, she continued. And now that he thinks he lost, he's trying to change the rules. I leaned back in my chair. Thomas Reynolds had already warned me that Robert might try something like this. But hearing it confirmed still carried a certain weight. Thank you for telling me, I said calmly. Chloe looked relieved. You're not angry? No. You're not even surprised? Not really. She shook her head slightly. You're handling this a lot better than I expected. I had a good teacher. Your father. Yes. Chloe studied me for a moment. You know, Robert made one huge mistake. What's that? He thought power came from money. I smiled slightly. And what do you think now? Chloe considered the question. I think power comes from knowing who you are. I stood up from the table. That's a good lesson. As I walked toward the door, Chloe called after me. Mary? I turned. I really am sorry. I believed her. But some apologies arrive after the story has already moved forward. And my story was already moving in a completely new direction. Chloe's warning stayed in my mind longer than I expected. Not because I feared Robert's next move, but because it confirmed something important about the man I had spent nearly 3 decades married to. Robert Johnson didn't know how to lose. The idea of accepting responsibility for his own choices simply didn't fit inside the worldview he had built around success and control. So instead of reflecting on what happened, he was already searching for a way to rewrite the story. The next morning, I called Thomas Reynolds. I think Robert might try to challenge the trust, I said. Thomas didn't sound surprised. Yes, I expected that possibility. You did. Men like Robert often assume every situation can be negotiated. And can this one? No. His calm confidence was reassuring. The trust was created long before your marriage, he continued. Legally, it's extremely well protected. What if he tries to argue that I hid the information from him? That argument won't succeed. Why not? Because you didn't know about the assets yourself. That was true. My father had made sure of that. The entire system had been designed so that no one, including me, could access the full picture until the trust activated. Your father understood people very well, Thomas added. Yes, I said quietly. He also understood lawyers. That made me smile slightly. Robert's going to waste a lot of money trying to challenge something he can't change, Thomas said. I suspected that. If he files anything formal, we'll handle it. I ended the call feeling more relaxed, but the situation still made me reflect on something deeper. Robert wasn't just fighting for money. He was fighting for his identity. For years, he had built his sense of worth around being the more successful partner in our marriage, the one with the powerful career, the one with the financial knowledge, the one who understood how the world worked. Now the truth had turned that belief upside down, and people like Robert rarely handle that kind of reversal gracefully. A few days later, Daniel Brooks invited me to visit one of Bennett Holdings' investment projects. It was a medical research facility just outside San Diego. This is one of your father's favorite investments, Daniel explained as we walked through the building. What makes it special? They're developing early detection technologies for neurological diseases. I watched the scientists working inside the laboratory. Researchers in white coats moved carefully between equipment studying samples and data screens. Your father believed strongly in investing in things that actually improve people's lives. Daniel continued. That sounds like him. Some investors focus only on profit. And Bennett Holdings. We focus on impact. The more I learned about the company, the more I began to understand the philosophy behind my father's decisions. He hadn't built Bennett Holdings as a symbol of wealth. He had built it as a tool, a way to support ideas, research, and projects that might otherwise struggle to find funding. Standing there in the research facility, I suddenly felt something I hadn't expected. Purpose. For years, my work teaching art had given me a sense of meaning, helping children discover creativity, encouraging them to express themselves. Now, unexpectedly, my father had given me a different kind of opportunity, the chance to support ideas that could change lives on a much larger scale. Daniel seemed to notice the shift in my expression. You're thinking about something, he said. I am. What is it? I think I finally understand why my father structured everything the way he did. Daniel smiled. Tell me. He wanted to make sure the company stayed in the hands of someone who valued the mission. And you do. I'm starting to. Daniel nodded. I had a feeling you would. Later that evening, I returned to my apartment and checked my messages. There were several new emails, 2 from journalists requesting interviews, 1 from a charity organization asking about possible partnerships, and 1 from an unfamiliar law firm. I opened the last message. It was brief. Asterisk, asterisk. Subject legal notice. Asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk, asterisk. Mrs. Johnson, asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk, asterisk. Our client Robert Johnson is preparing to file a motion regarding the financial disclosure associated with your recent divorce proceedings. Asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk, asterisk. We would appreciate the opportunity to discuss the matter before formal filings occur. Asterisk, asterisk. I stared at the message for a moment, so Chloe had been right. Robert was already trying to escalate the situation. I forwarded the email to Thomas Reynolds without responding. His reply came 15 minutes later. Asterisk, asterisk. Do not worry, this is exactly what we expected. Asterisk, asterisk. That was all he wrote. No panic, no urgency, just quiet confidence. I closed the laptop and walked out onto the balcony. The sun was setting over the ocean again, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. A month ago, my life had felt like it was falling apart. Now it felt like it was expanding in directions I never imagined. Not because of the money, but because of what the money allowed me to do. My phone buzzed again. Another message. This one from Laura. Asterisk, asterisk. Did you see the news about Robert asterisk, asterisk? I frowned and opened the link she sent. It was a short article from a legal industry website. Asterisk, asterisk. Corporate attorney Robert Johnson faces internal review after conflict of interest concerns. Asterisk, asterisk. Apparently, Robert's aggressive attempts to challenge the trust had created complications with some of his firm's clients who were also connected to investment firms working with Bennett Holdings. The situation wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't good either. Reputation mattered in Robert's profession, and right now his reputation was under pressure. I closed the article slowly. The story was unfolding exactly the way my father probably expected it would, not through revenge, not through confrontation, just through the quiet consequences of people's choices. Robert had chosen ambition over loyalty. He had chosen excitement over stability. He had chosen what he believed was the better opportunity. And now he was discovering that the opportunity he walked away from was something he could never get back. As I stood there watching the sunset, I realized something surprising. I didn't feel anger toward him anymore. I felt something closer to acceptance. Because sometimes the greatest justice in life isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's simply the moment when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. About 2 weeks after Robert's lawyers sent their warning email, I saw him again. Not in a courtroom, not at a dramatic confrontation, but in the most ordinary place imaginable, a grocery store. It was a Saturday morning, and I had stopped by a small market near the harbor to pick up a few things for the weekend. The store was quiet, filled with the soft hum of refrigerators and the occasional chatter of customers moving between aisles. I was reaching for a carton of almond milk when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Mary. For a moment I thought I imagined it. Then I turned around. Robert Johnson stood at the end of the aisle. He looked different. Not dramatically different, but enough that I noticed immediately. His suit was gone. Instead, he wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans. His hair looked slightly more disheveled than I remembered, and there were faint shadows under his eyes. The confident corporate attorney I had known for nearly 3 decades suddenly looked tired. "Hello, Robert," I said calmly. For a few seconds he didn't speak. He just studied my face. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said finally. "It's a grocery store," I replied. "People usually come here for food." He gave a small, awkward smile. "Yes, I suppose they do." The moment felt strange. Not tense, just unfamiliar. Like 2 people who once shared a life but now belonged to completely different worlds. "How have you been?" he asked. "Busy." "I can imagine." He shifted his weight slightly, glancing down the aisle as if making sure no one was listening. "I saw the articles about the research facility you're funding," he said. "Oh, neurological disease detection?" "Yes, that's impressive." "Thank you." He nodded slowly. "It sounds like something your father would have cared about." "Yes," I said softly. "It does." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Robert sighed. "I guess this is the part where I tell you I was wrong." I raised an eyebrow. "That's a new development." He gave a quiet laugh. "Apparently divorce can be very educational." "I'm sure it can." He leaned against the shopping cart beside him. My lawyer finally explained the trust structure to me in detail. and there was never any chance I could challenge it. That's what I heard. I spent nearly 2 weeks trying to find a way around it. That must have been frustrating. It was humiliating. His honesty surprised me. For years, Robert had been extremely careful about protecting his image of success. Admitting humiliation was not something he did easily. "What about your firm?" I asked. He shrugged slightly. "I'm still there. But some clients don't like drama. That's understandable." He nodded. "Especially when the drama involves billion-dollar headlines." I couldn't help smiling faintly. "I imagine that complicates things." "It does." Another silence settled between us. Then Robert said something I hadn't expected. "You look happy." I thought about that. Was I happy? The last few months had been chaotic, unexpected, emotionally exhausting. But underneath all of that, "Yes, I think I am," I said. Robert nodded slowly. "I'm glad." He sounded sincere. "Are you?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "I'm learning." "Learning what?" "That ambition doesn't automatically lead to a better life." I studied him for a moment. The man standing in front of me still looked like Robert Johnson, but something in his expression had changed. Less arrogance, more reflection. "You built your identity around success," I said gently. "That's true. And now I'm trying to figure out what success actually means." He glanced toward the store's front windows where sunlight streamed through the glass. For 30 years, I thought winning meant having more than everyone else. And now I'm realizing that sometimes winning means not losing what you already have. The words hung quietly in the air between us. For the first time since our divorce, the conversation didn't feel like a negotiation. It felt honest. "I'm sorry for how things ended," he said after a moment. "I know. I mean that. I believe you. But I also know sorry doesn't fix anything." "No," I agreed, "it doesn't." Another pause. Then he smiled faintly. "You know what the worst part is?" "What?" "If I had stayed married to you, everyone would think I was a genius right now." I laughed softly. "That's probably true. I'd be the brilliant lawyer married to the billionaire investor. Instead, I'm the guy who divorced her 2 weeks before the trust activated." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "That's quite a reputation," I said. "Yes," he replied, "it is." He straightened up and picked up his shopping basket. "Well, I suppose this is where we say goodbye again." "Probably." Robert hesitated for a moment. "Yes, I really do hope your father's company changes the world the way he wanted it to." "I'll do my best." He nodded once. "I think you will." Then he turned and walked down the aisle toward the checkout counters. I watched him go for a moment, not with anger, not with regret, just with a quiet sense of closure. Because sometimes the final chapter of a relationship doesn't end with a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it ends in the middle of a grocery store, with two people finally understanding exactly who they are and who they are not. 6 months after my divorce, my life looked completely different from anything I had imagined before. Not because of the money, although $2 billion does tend to change a few practical details, but the real difference was something deeper. Freedom. For the first time in decades, every major decision in my life belonged entirely to me. No expectations, no compromises, no quiet pressure to fit into someone else's definition of success. Bennett Holdings had continued operating smoothly under Daniel Brooks and the executive team. My role had slowly evolved from curious observer to active participant. I attended strategy meetings, reviewed long-term investment plans, and most importantly, I helped guide the company toward projects that aligned with the vision my father had always believed in. Research, education, innovation that actually improved people's lives. One of the first major initiatives we launched was the *** Bennett Foundation for Creative Education, ***. The idea came from something simple. The art classes I used to teach. For years, I had watched children discover confidence through creativity. Kids who struggled in traditional classrooms suddenly came alive when they were given a paintbrush or a sketchbook. My father had built a financial empire quietly. Now I wanted to use part of that empire to give other people opportunities. Within 6 months, the foundation funded art programs in dozens of community centers across California. The response was overwhelming. Teachers wrote letters describing students who finally felt seen. Parents shared stories about children who had discovered talents they never knew they had. For the first time since my father passed away, I felt like I was continuing something meaningful that he had started. One evening, Daniel and I were reviewing reports in the Bennett Holdings conference room when he asked me something unexpected. "Have you noticed something interesting about your story?" "What's that?" I asked. "Most people assume your life changed the moment you inherited the company." "That's what the headline said." "Yes," Daniel replied, "but the truth is, your life actually changed the moment Robert left." I thought about that. He was right. The divorce had been painful, confusing, devastating at the time. But it had also opened a door that I never would have seen otherwise. "If Robert hadn't walked away," I said slowly, "the trust wouldn't have activated, and I'd still be teaching art classes part-time, wondering why my marriage felt so distant." Daniel smiled. "Life has a strange way of revealing the truth. It really does." Later that night, I returned to the beachside apartment that had gradually started to feel like home. The ocean waves rolled steadily against the shore the same way they had every night since I moved there. I walked out onto the balcony and looked up at the stars. For a moment, I thought about my father. Edward Bennett had never been a dramatic man. He didn't leave behind speeches or grand declarations about his wealth. Instead, he left something far more powerful: a system. A quiet, carefully designed plan that would protect his daughter long after he was gone. I reached into the drawer beside my bed and took out the letter he had written. The same letter I had read in Thomas Reynolds' office months earlier. I unfolded the paper and read the final lines again. Asterisk, one day the right person will come into your life. Asterisk, and that person will value you long before they ever know what you are worth. For years, I thought those words were about romantic love. Now I understood something else. The most important relationship I needed to build first was the one with myself. Confidence, purpose, self-respect. Those things had nothing to do with money. They came from knowing who you are and refusing to accept less than you deserve. My phone buzzed on the bedside table. A message from Laura. Asterisk, asterisk. Guess what? Asterisk, asterisk. I smiled and typed back. Asterisk, asterisk. What now? Asterisk, asterisk. Her response came quickly. Asterisk, asterisk. The kids at the community center just sent pictures of their art projects. They're naming the new classroom after U. Asterisk, asterisk. I laughed quietly. That meant more to me than any financial headline ever could. I looked back out at the ocean. 6 months earlier, I had believed my life was falling apart. My husband had left. My marriage had ended. The future looked uncertain. But sometimes the end of one life is simply the beginning of another. Robert Johnson had believed he was walking away from an ordinary woman. What he didn't realize was that the woman he left behind was about to rediscover everything she was truly capable of, not because she suddenly became wealthy, but because she finally became free. And in the end, that freedom turned out to be the greatest gift my father ever gave me. Life has a strange way of revealing the truth about people. Sometimes it happens slowly over years. And sometimes it happens all at once in a single moment when everything changes. When my husband left me for a woman 30 years younger, I thought I had lost everything. 27 years of marriage, a life I believed was stable, a future I thought was secure. But what I eventually discovered is something many people learn too late. The people who walk away from you are often the ones who were never meant to stay. And the losses that feel devastating in the moment can sometimes become the very events that set you free. Money can change circumstances, but it doesn't change character. Greed, ambition to loyalty, integrity. Those qualities were already present in every person involved in this story long before the headlines appeared. Robert didn't become greedy when the money surfaced. He simply revealed who he had always been. And I didn't become strong because I inherited a company. I became strong because I finally understood my own worth. So I want to ask you something. If you discovered tomorrow that someone you loved had only valued you for what they thought you didn't have, what would you do? Would you fight to prove your worth to them? Or would you walk away and build a life that proves it to yourself? Tell me in the comments. I read your stories every day and they remind me how many people around the world are going through struggles we rarely talk about. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that your value isn't defined by someone else's opinion, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us we are stronger than we ever believed.